I'm going to go ahead and get started just for the sake of time. I know Phil has a lot of great information to share with us today. My name is Zoe. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Director of Engagement and Program Development with Bestie B&B, which is an online platform that partners with social service and animal welfare agencies to help them create pet support programming and crisis fostering. Um, you are joining us here today to hear from Phil Arkow, who is the President and Secretary of the National Link Coalition. And today's session is Protecting Women, Woman's Best Friend, and the Homeless through Pet Inclusive Protection Orders. I first got connected with Phil and learned of his amazing work when I was working at a domestic violence agency for about 8 years managing their pet support program. And every time I've had a chance to join one of Phil's sessions, I've been so impressed and have always learned something. So I'm really happy to be here with you guys today and to be here with Phil. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to you. Thanks so much for joining us today, and I'm super excited to hear what you have to say, Phil.
Thanks, Zoe. It's a pleasure to see you again and all the people out here on the webinar. My pleasure. I have been interested in My Dog is My Home for a number of years, but frankly, this is the first time I've had a chance to interact with the organization on this kind of a level. So it's a pleasure. My name's Phil Arkow, and I'm head of this organization called the National Link Coalition. The link refers to the areas where animal cruelty is linked and connected to domestic violence, but also child abuse and elder abuse. I'll tell you a little bit more about that as we go along here. Basic premise behind this is that there are obviously a lot of reasons why people become homeless. But one of the most significant reasons is a history of domestic violence, which forces women and children in particular to leave, and homelessness and long-term dislocation is obviously an issue for them. So it's an interesting way for us to bridge this connection between the link itself and the homeless issues as well. There's my email address. There's our website address. We're going to try to I'm going to give you a lot of information. I'm going to go through it fairly quickly and try to leave some time for Q&A at the end. If we don't answer your questions and get around to all of them, please feel free to shoot me an email, and I'll be more than pleased to, help you out offline. Talking about women's best friend. And in particular, one of the new strategies that has emerged in the last few years, pet protection orders, as we call them, as a way to protect all the members of the family, whether they have two legs or four. Okay, let me see if I can, there we go. Okay. The link has several key principles underlying it. One is polyvictimization. For far too long, people have thought of animal cruelty as a standalone issue, where boys will be boys, or it's only a squirrel, or whatever. But the fact is, we now have 40 years worth of research and 40 years worth of programming that are showing that it isn't a standalone issue anymore. When animals are abused, people are at risk. And conversely, when people are abused, animals are at risk. It's really just as simple as that. Um, and particularly in the domestic violence sphere, the pets become weaponized. When I'm talking about domestic violence, I'm going to assume it's a man abusing a woman. We know we have women who abuse men. We know we've been in partner violence and same-sex relationships, but just to keep it simple, I'll assume it's a man abusing a woman. And invariably, it's the woman in the household who's got the emotional attachments to the animals and the responsibility for caring for them. We're talking about companion animals, of course. And the abuser will exploit any weak link he can find. And that attachment to the animals becomes a weak link. And the abuser threatens the woman and the children with harming or killing the animals if they don't obey him. Consequently, the women wind up staying for fear of what will happen if they leave. I'm going to show you some statistics documenting all that. And the result is people are trapped in toxic relationships. The animals are soft targets, and everybody suffers as a result. This fear for what might happen to the animals becomes an enormous barrier. I'll give you some statistics on that too. Don't feel compelled to memorize the numbers, by the way. We're not going to have a quiz on it, but I want to show you we have research substantiating all this. It's part of an overall pattern of coercive control, and it's a huge barrier that prevents women and children from escaping intimate partner violence. And as I mentioned earlier, those who do manage to escape often wind up being homeless as a result. If we take stronger measures to prevent animal cruelty, to prosecute it, and to punish the offenders. We certainly benefit man's best friend, but we also benefit man. And you'll see by the end of this program here that we really benefit women in particular because of this domestic violence connection. The link connects the dots, and it takes animal cruelty work back to its origins, back to its roots. And the premise of this was that animal cruelty laws, and the U.S. has the world's oldest laws, they go back to 1641, back to our colonial era. These laws have always been in place, not because of animal rights issue, but because animal abuse is seen as harming property and harming community values. It's a human welfare issue as much as an animal welfare issue. And by focusing on that aspect, we make more legislative progress because, frankly, legislators don't care about animal welfare because animals don't vote. But if we show legislators how animal abuse also hurts people, of course it hurts animals, but by showing that it also hurts people, they're more likely to sit and take notice. So we were formed in 2008. We were incorporated as a nonprofit just a couple years ago. And there are a lot of nonprofits out there that address domestic violence or child abuse or elder abuse or animal cruelty. We're the only one that really addresses all four. And we work in four primary areas. We do public awareness and training programs like this. We showcase terrific programs like what Bestie B&B is doing. We checked legislation. We're looking at 174 bills right now in state legislatures and Congress. And we substantiated this all by collating academic research. We've got over 2,400 citations in our bibliography. We publish a free monthly newsletter. It's called the Link Letter. And again, if you'd like to receive this, I'd love to have you on our mailing list. And we're not going to spam you or send you junk mail or anything or sell your names. Just shoot us an email here. Tell us what organization you're with, and we'll add you to the link letter list. There is so much going on in this field on a global basis. We are the global resource center for all this information. Goal of all this is to make our families and our communities safer by showing how animal abuse and other forms of family violence are linked. Tell you a little bit about how I got here and some of the light bulb moments that got me inspired on this way back in the 1980s and put this issue on my radar screen. At the time, I was in Colorado Springs, Colorado. I was the humane educator for the local humane society. And I was sitting at my desk one day, and a research paper crossed my desk from my alma mater, the University of Pennsylvania. A woman in the School of Social Work took a year's worth of data from Bucks County, Pennsylvania. That's the county just north of Philadelphia, and looked at a year's worth of data from the Bucks County Child Protection Agency and the Bucks County SPCA, the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, and found that in 9% of the cases they overlapped. Child protection and animal protection were dealing with the same families, but they were in silos. They weren't talking to each other. And I thought, what's wrong with that picture? Okay. The child protection movement came out of animal protection. The humane movement gave birth to the child protection movement back in the 1870s. And here it was 100 years later, and they weren't talking to each other. And I thought, what's wrong with that picture? About the same time, I did an in-service training for some teachers in Colorado Springs, and I brought a local veterinarian in to talk about pet care. And at the time, I was the only delegate from the humane movement within the American Veterinary Medical Association. I spent 9 years on their animal welfare committee. It's the only non-vet among 60,000 veterinarians. And it was an interesting experience. But anyway, I had one of those light bulb moments. I turned to the veterinarian. I said, Doc, every teacher in this room is mandated by state law to report suspected child abuse. And I know everybody in the human healthcare field is a mandated reporter of child abuse, but what about veterinarians? You've got the same training as physicians. In fact, your work is harder than a physician because you've got to treat multiple species and your patients can't tell you where it hurts. Do you have to report child abuse? He thought a minute. He said, as a matter of fact, I do. Colorado is the only state in the country that specifically named veterinarians as mandated reporters of child abuse. In 49 states, it wasn't on their radar screen. And I thought, wow, isn't that interesting? Let me take that one step further. Would you have to report animal cruelty to us at the Humane Society? He said, no, why would I want to do that? I might lose a client. And I thought, gee, what's wrong with that picture? Shouldn't the veterinarian be as proactive in responding to animal abuse as a pediatrician is in responding to child abuse? And then shortly after that, I was the after dinner speaker at our local domestic violence shelter's annual meeting. And I was waiting to go on, and I have to admit, I knew absolutely nothing about the domestic violence field. And I was waiting to go on. I was looking at some of their literature in the lobby there. And I opened up one of their newsletters, and there on page three were these four drawings by children in the shelter. And three of the four pictures were of animals that had been killed or hurt by daddy's or mommy's boyfriend as a way to warn them that they would be next. And I remember thinking, and this is 40 some odd years ago, I remember thinking, wow, this is a whole aspect of animal abuse we've never really thought about. Whoops, let me see if can I go back here? There we go. Okay. Um, Fast forward to 2004, and I was at the conference of IAHIO. That's the International Association of Human Animal Interaction Organizations, International Global Network of Animal Therapy Programs and Human Animal Bond Programs. I happened to be in Edinburgh. And they unveiled at that meeting a video, which was absolutely groundbreaking. It was an interview with street people. And the British or Scottish term for that is sleeping rough, Rough, and they called it sleeping rough, like a dog, okay? Interviewing Edinburgh street dogs and their people. It's a fabulous video. If you can wade through the Scottish brogue, it's the most brilliant insights into homeless people and the affection that they have for their animals, and how they depend on them for security and comfort and companionship. There's the link to it. Okay, it's on Vimeo. It's a tremendous video, and I don't think I've ever seen anything since then that's really matched that. The link connects the dots. There are four forms of family violence, and people in the human services sectors are familiar with the right side of your screen: child protection, domestic violence, and elder abuse. And they don't even think about the animal protection side. And that's always been on the periphery because it's only an animal. And those of us in the animal side always thought the human services folks had their act together because they get all the government money. And the human services folks think, oh, I see those appealing, commercials from the ASPCA on TV. You guys get all the money. And the fact is, nobody's got enough money. And the fact is, it wasn't until the early 1990s that the first national conference was held on the impact of domestic violence on children. And it wasn't until the early 90s that people began to recognize that domestic violence affects older couples as well. Again, the animal folks were always excluded. Well, the link changes that and takes those four silos and recognizes that there is no animal welfare without human welfare and vice versa. And we get rid of that model, and this is what the link looks like. And it's four overlapping circles. And the fact is that anybody working in any one of those spheres can see other forms of family violence. And they don't have to be an expert at it. They need to be sensitized to it, know a little bit about what to look for, and know who to call to make a referral to the appropriate agency in their community. And then, of course, for My Dog is My Home's perspective, homelessness overlaps all of that. Um, it's a very distinct part of the link, and it can touch all four areas, but I'm going to focus on the domestic violence aspect of it. The unfortunate reality, more than half of homeless women report that domestic violence was the immediate cause of why they became homeless. 90% of homeless women have experienced physical or sexual abuse. Almost two-thirds of homeless women have been victims of domestic or sexual violence. So you can see those enormous overlaps. And when you combine that with the risks of animal abuse within the domestic violence and sexual assault arena, you can see how these all come together. We've identified 8 distinct types of links. I'm going to concentrate more on the domestic violence area, but I want to just familiarize you with the others. The pets, like I said, become weaponized as a way for him to exert power and control. The numbers are ridiculous. Okay. Survey of the National Domestic Violence Hotline, 2,500 women. We've had a lot of surveys of women in shelters. This was the only one of women hadn't gotten in a shelter yet. 97% of them said that fear for what would happen to their animals was a deterrent to whether they would leave, and 50% would not leave unless security for their pets could be taken care of, which is why we need more pet-friendly shelters like what Bestie B&B is working on. It's a form of emotional extortion. Flip side of that, or second aspect of that, is child sexual abuse, where the abuser warns the little boy or girl that if they talk, he'll strangle her bunny, and now, or his bunny. And now this child is living under multiple layers of fear and confusion and also has to worry about saving the life of a beloved pet. We need to think of childhood acts of animal cruelty as adverse childhood experiences. They are not considered that because the Centers for Disease Control never thought about it. They said it's only an animal. But the fact is, children who harm animals are at extreme risk of later acts of antisocial violence. It's one of the earliest indicators of conduct disorder. It starts showing up at about the age of 6.5. We have issues of bullying behaviors, and it's not just youths who bully others, who, as you might expect, are more aggressive towards animals. It's those who have been bullied transfer all that negative energy and redirect it down the totem pole at animals. Animal hoarding is strongly linked to older populations and occur anytime across the lifespan, but it's often older, isolated women, and so it's linked with elder abuse issues. Dogfighting and cockfighting are not only horrible for the animals, but they're linked with homicides, narcotics trafficking, sex trafficking, weapons offenses, and a wide range of other crimes. There are too many people out there who prefer to have sex with animals. We call it animal sexual abuse. It is linked very strongly with child sexual abuse. There's animal pornography that's linked with child pornography. And then the school shooters, about 10% of them have been torturing animals. It is a mistake to say all serial killers started out hurting animals. Most of them did not, but many of them have. And doesn't mean that every little kid who kicks the cat is going to grow up to become another Jeffrey Dahmer, but some of them do. Why do we need to take animal abuse seriously? Because it's often the first link in the chain. It's often the first indicator that something is wrong in a household. It may be the first way to stop the cycle of violence. And whoever investigates animal abuse in your community should be considered a first responder, and they're often the first point of social services or law enforcement intervention in a family experiencing other problems. I'll give you an example. This is one from suburban Philadelphia, Montgomery County, Pennsylvania. A bitterly cold night in January, the neighbors next door were worried about the welfare of a Great Dane in that doghouse in the backyard of a snowy field. And this is a key area because a lot of animal abuse occurs outdoors where the neighbors can see it and they know the dog can't pick up the phone and dial 911. The animal abuse investigators often are the first to get the call. In this case, it happened to be the police department. The police came, they called the Montgomery County SPCA. They took the dog away. Police went in the house and found a dead 4-year-old boy who had been beaten to death for committing the horrible crime of looking at somebody while they were going to the bathroom. The tenant was Reverend Javin McBurrows. He and his wife had 7 children, 4 of their own, 3 foster kids, and don't ask me how they ever got into the foster care system, because 6 of the 7 children had been beaten at various times in their lives. The couple and the surviving children fled to Atlanta. They were eventually apprehended, brought back to Philly. He was prosecuted and got 22 years in prison for the death of the child. But that's not the end of the story. In addition to the fact that the animal abuse triggers the investigation, second part of this story is that exactly 4 years before this, McBurrows had been convicted of domestic violence. And 4 years before that, he had been convicted of animal cruelty. And none of the agencies in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, were interfacing with each other. They were in their silos. And I don't mean to single out that county. We see that pattern over and over and over again. The fact is, families are extremely attached to their pets. 99% of us think of our pets as companions or as members of the family. Only 1% think of them as property. But that creates an enormous disconnect because legally they are property. They're in the same category as a toaster. But no abused woman ever ran back to her abuser because she was afraid of what would happen to her toaster. But they go back time and time again to protect their animals. The national average right now, I believe, is that it takes 7 incidents before she finally is able to work up the courage and the ability to leave. When animal abuse is thrown into the mix, it can be as many as 50 prior episodes. Where do we find these pets? Overwhelmingly in homes with children. And you can see the numbers there, whether it's children under age 6 or over age 6. pets are predominantly in the home with kids, and the woman is overwhelmingly the caregiver. So that means veterinarians in particular are going to see three of the primary populations who could be at risk for family violence, because the stereotype situation is the woman with the kids going to the vet on Saturday morning, taking the pet in for treatment. Animal abuse is the tip of the iceberg. And whether it's animal control or law enforcement or a humane society or an SPCA who investigates, they may not only see other forms of family violence, but also a wide range of other social problems, whether it's housing insecurity, substance abuse, marital problems, unemployment, drugs, financial woes, you name it. One of the complications for this is that unlike the child or domestic or elder abuse fields, there is absolutely no consistency anywhere in this country in terms of who is going to investigate animal cruelty. It's all handled purely on the local level by local agencies that have no state or national coordination. Because people don't know who to call, we created a directory. If you go to our website, nationallinkcoalition.org, you will see the national directory, 6,500 cities and counties, and it's ridiculous, okay? There are, in any given state, there's one number to call to report child abuse, one or two numbers to report domestic violence, one or two numbers to report elder abuse, and as many as 600 different numbers to report animal cruelty. Check that out just so you know who to call. Let's talk a little bit about the domestic violence connection here. Here's another case study, again from Philadelphia. Philly isn't any more violent than anywhere else, except when my Eagles are playing the Cowboys, but don't get me started. Um, as Sandra Rutolo explained to the judge, she was thinking of her dogs when she pulled the trigger. For 13 years, her husband battered her, but one night he not only whipped her with a vacuum cleaner cord, he also punched one of her 4 German shepherds and warned her that if she left, he would find her and slit the dog's throat in front of her. Later that night, as her husband slept, she loaded a 38 caliber pistol and pointed it at herself. A moment away from suicide, she looked at her oldest dog and said, "Duchess, if I die, what's going to happen to you?" So instead, she walked into her husband's bedroom and shot him. Well, she got 10 to 20 years for third-degree murder. And that shows how these animals are weaponized and they're victims in this whole coercive control mechanism there. I'll give you some of the most significant findings we've come up with over the years, and we've got a lot more. One study was trying to identify what are the 4 greatest risk factors for somebody becoming a domestic violence abuser. They identified 4, and the first 3 didn't surprise them. A history of mental illness, substance abuse issues, low education levels. No big surprises there. But the 4th factor, they hadn't expected this, was this history of animal cruelty. It's one of the 4 greatest risk factors for somebody becoming an abuser. Study in Canada found that children who are exposed to domestic violence are 3 times more likely to be cruel to animals. The family violence just transcends the species lines. Domestic violence women, victims, they're 11 times more likely than non-abused women to report that their partner hurt or killed the animals. A study in Wisconsin showed that not only did more than 2/3 of these women reveal the animal abuse, 3/4 of them said it was committed in the presence of the women and the children as a way to coerce and control them. Another study, third of abused women reported their children harmed animals. It's an intergenerational cycle of violence. Andrew Campbell is doing tremendous work in Indianapolis. One of the key things he's found is that when you talk to any law enforcement officer, they'll tell you the cases they fear the most are domestic violence incidents because it's highly volatile and the people are often armed, and there's a high risk of death for first responders in domestic violence situations. That risk of death doubles when animal abuse is also thrown into the mix. We know how big a risk strangulation factor is in domestic violence. More than 3/4 of women in homes where there's domestic violence and animal abuse had been strangled. As I mentioned earlier, it can be as many as 50 prior incidents before they're able to call for help. 80% of these women were afraid for their lives. A quarter of them had been forced to have sex with the guy. The Domestic violence is more hands-on, it's more violent, it's more long-lasting when animal cruelty is thrown into it. Here's that study I mentioned earlier from the National Domestic Violence Hotline. Look at the bottom number there. Three-quarters of the women calling the hotline were not aware of the fact that we now have 300 pet-friendly shelters in the United States and another 80 some odd in other countries as well. That's not a lot, believe it or not. There are many more shelters that are not pet friendly, but we're working to try to improve that. This is what that cycle of violence looks like. The abuser harms or threatens the animals. The survivors stay. They're trapped in that toxic relationship. The children are exposed to both the domestic violence and the animal abuse. They become violent or victims and grow up to become abusers themselves. And it's all part of this pattern of coercive control and retribution and retaliation and threats. It can occur during the relationship. It's a way for him to warn the rest of the family, I did it to your dog, you're going to be next. It creates a culture in that family where violence is normal. He'll also do it because he's jealous, because she's more emotionally attached to the animals than she is to him. And they do it because they think they can get away with it, because they think the cops don't care. And the fact is, in many cases, they're right. What we're also finding out is that the abuse of the animals takes place after she leaves as well. We know the most volatile time in a domestic violence situation is when she's actually leaving. The threats to the animal can occur then, before, or afterwards. He can punish the animals after she leaves as punishment for her leaving. It creates an anxiety forcing her to return. And it's not just her animals. It can be the animals of friends or family who help her escape, and they could be targeted for as long as 2 years afterwards. I don't know if you're familiar with what's often called the Duluth model. This was designed by the Domestic Violence Agency in Duluth, Minnesota, many years ago, when everybody thought domestic violence was just physical abuse, and they made everybody realize, no, it isn't. It's all about power and control. Physical abuse is often, a wraparound around the whole thing, but you can see the 8 distinct areas of emotional and psychological and financial abuse that are part of that. And I'll show you how the animals fit into that model. We have these coercive control threats if she asserts any independence or threatens to leave. There's an isolation factor. He wants to keep her away from her family or friends or anybody who can help her escape. He'll keep her from going to the doggy park or going to the vet or socializing with pets. And we all know how pets are a magnet that bring us together. Boy, did we see that during the COVID lockdowns, when the only chance we got to talk to our neighbors was walking dogs on opposite sides of the street. There's emotional abuse. It could be as simple as calling her bitch. It can be as intense as forcing her to eat out of the dog food bowl or having sex with animals or watching animal pornography. There's economic abuse. He controls the purse strings. He won't let her spend any money on anything, and that includes on pet care and the vet bills. And the animal gets sick, and then he blames her for that happening. There's this intimidation factor, which we've already talked about. The kids get dragged into this. He'll harm the animals, blame it on mommy, and try to drive a wedge between her and the kids. Of course, he'll deny doing it. He'll blame somebody else like he does for everything else. And then we have this legal issue. Because the animals are property, and they're going to remain as such for the foreseeable future, if this domestic violence scenario winds up in a divorce, who's going to get custody? And I'm going to show you how we're taking care of that. I have been in animal shelters where one party brings an animal in and puts it up for adoption so the other party doesn't get it in the divorce settlement. So it's a wake-up call. There are lots of reasons why she doesn't leave. Lots of reasons she says, oh, it's my fault, or he didn't mean to do it, or it was an accident, or whatever. And we need to tell her, look, if he's hurting harmless animals, it's not your fault. It's not the cat's fault. It's his fault. You and the kids and the pets need to make a safety plan to be able to get out of there and take the pets with you. Let me tell you about some of the things that are going on around the country and around the world. This is an extremely dynamic field. There's an awful lot happening, and it's all been in recent years. One is back in the early 1990s, most state laws addressing animal cruelty were misdemeanors. Once we started talking about how animal cruelty also hurts people, legislators began taking notice. And today, all 50 states have at least some laws in the book that are felony level crimes. Doesn't mean they all are, because they're not. Doesn't mean they're all enforced, because they're not. But at least somewhere on the books in all 50 states, there are some crimes that are categorized as felonies instead of misdemeanors or petty offenses. And that has been a major step forward. We now have 22 states. You can see the map there, in which these acts of coercive control, domestic, animal abuse within the domestic violence connection are not only defined by statute as acts of animal cruelty, they're also defined as domestic violence or as stalking or as coercion. And you can see the map there. I know you can't see the statutory numbers, but if you email me, I'll give you, a copy of the map or, give you the statute numbers. But at least in 22 states, we now have ways to prosecute these cases two ways, both an act of animal cruelty and an act of domestic violence or coercive control. Excuse me. Remember, I asked about, who's going to get the pet in, case this winds up in a divorce. Alaska pioneered this back in 2016. We now have 8 states in which courts can specifically award custody of animals in a divorce settlement based on whatever the court decides is in the animal's best interest. And that can make for some thorny judicial discussions in terms of what is really best. And so what we're doing is we're encouraging domestic violence survivors to get all the paperwork in her name. The license, the rabies vaccination, the any other vaccines, the vet bills, the pet food bills, the pedigree papers, whatever they can document to show that they've been the primary caregiver. It's going to give her a leg up when it comes time to decide who's going to get these animals if this winds up in a divorce. And we're working with the Uniform Law Commission to try to devise a model law so the other 42 states that will eventually start thinking about this will have something to follow. Sex with animals used to be considered a normal rite of passage for boys, particularly on the farm. Once we started talking about how animal sex abuse is linked with child sex abuse, legislators began to take notice. And today, 49 states make sex with animals illegal. The outlier is West Virginia. And just last week, for the umpteenth time, I've lost count, the West Virginia legislature once again decided to keep sex with animals legal. And we're not sure what the problem is in West Virginia. But in 49 states, it's against the law. The states in dark blue, it's a felony. The light blue, it's a misdemeanor. The gray states, it's a felony on a second or subsequent offense. It's also illegal now in the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and that's been a relatively new advance as well. Remember that veterinarian who said, "Why would I want to report animal cruelty? I might lose a client." We now have 43 states in which veterinarians are either mandated or permitted to report suspected animal abuse. The states in blue, they're mandated to report. The states in green, they're permitted to report. And in 36 of those states, the ones with the yellow check marks, they have immunity from civil and criminal liability for making a report to the appropriate authorities in good faith. And that's been a major step forward, getting veterinarians to recognize that they should be as proactive in this as physicians are in responding to suspected child abuse. We still have 8 states to go. And if any of you are in South Carolina or Iowa or South Dakota or Montana, Wyoming, 7 states, New Jersey, Delaware, we need your legislative support on that. And we're trying to get veterinarians to sail off into uncharted territory. What should the veterinarian's responsibility be as a public health official, which is what veterinarians are? What should his or her responsibility be when suspected domestic violence walks in the door? Or for that matter, when there's domestic violence among the staff? And let's face it, 70% of veterinary students right now are women. The overwhelming majority of veterinary staff are women. So obviously there's going to be domestic violence surrounding the veterinary environment. In 2015, the New Zealand Veterinary Association broke new ground with this, and they signed on to a national initiative in New Zealand to combat domestic violence. And I love the language. They called veterinary medicine a three-dimensional profession with a unique voice that transcends animal life, human life, and the environment. It's what we now call a One Health movement, or it's called One Welfare in the British countries. Okay. In 2016, Scotland came on board. They came up with a national initiative to address domestic violence, and they decided the best way to do this was to train frontline workers who were most likely to encounter abused women. Then they had to identify what three professions might be most likely to encounter an abused woman. Turns out veterinarians are one of the three professions, along with dentists and beauticians. So veterinarians should be right there on the front line of addressing domestic violence. We're trying to get domestic violence agencies and homeless shelters and any other civil, social service agencies to recognize the need to include pets in safety planning. Okay. That's not only getting all the documentation in her name, but also having a go bag with all the supplies that that pet's going to need. If she's got a 15-minute window while he's down at the corner getting a drink, for her and the kids and the pets to get out of there on short notice. We have samples of these, several of these safety plannings that include pets on our website, nationallinkcoalition.org. They're free for the copying. Again, feel free to borrow any of these and change your programs to include this. Picture in the upper left-hand corner, I love it. It's from Harbor House in Orlando, Florida. They've got a whole campaign with pictures of kids and pets saying, why would we ask her to leave any of her babies behind? And Harbor House is one of the pet-friendly shelters. I call these pet-friendly shelters doggy witness protection programs, just to try to lighten up what's obviously a very emotionally difficult topic. We now have over 300 shelters in the U.S. and 80 plus in other countries that accept pets. There are several models for this. Say, Bestie B&B and Red Rover have programs. Other groups do too. Safety program, which is sheltering animals and families together. There's a handbook. There are lots of resources there right now to help shelters make this transition to accept pets. It sounds intimidating. There are certainly issues to be overcome, but it can be done. It doesn't have to be that scary. Other agencies have done it. And the newest frontier of this is to expand that into homeless shelters as well, where obviously the dynamics are somewhat different, but we can learn from what happened in the domestic violence shelters and apply that in homeless shelters. Red Rover is a great resource for all this. They have $60,000 grants available to domestic violence shelters and to homeless shelters now as well. That's been a new development for them to help them become pet friendly and build the infrastructure necessary to accommodate pets. Victim Services is beginning to recognize this. And I love this example. This happened years ago. We were doing a training program in Maryland, and the woman who headed the Baltimore Police Department's Victim Services program attended our workshop. And she was just about to go to press with these posters. The Baltimore Police Department had just started their first victim services program, and shows a woman and a child cowering in the corner, shadow of the perp looming over them. If you're having a problem, call the police department. A woman came to her program, light bulb went on, said, why didn't I think about the pets? And through the wonders of Photoshop, a dog was inserted in the posters. And I use this as an example to show once you realize that how easy, that this needs to be included, it's remarkably easy to do it. It's just a case of modifying the existing safety plan, existing materials. It can be done very easily. Another factor, another force that's at work here is what we call pet protection orders. This started in Maine in 2006 when Susan Walsh, the wife of a farmer, testified before the Maine state legislature that it wasn't just the dogs and the cats, it was the sheep and the chickens. She was afraid for their welfare. He'd run over an old dog with his car. He'd killed the animals. He wouldn't hesitate to do it before. And she stayed 12 years in that toxic relationship for fear of leaving because it wasn't just the pets, it was also the farm animals that were at risk. She testified before the Maine state legislature in 2006, and Maine became the first place in the world to allow pet protection orders. These are laws that specifically allow courts to include companion animals, and in some cases livestock, in domestic violence protection from abuse orders. Today, 42 states have similar laws, and you can see the map there and what year those laws went into effect, depending on what state you're in. The federal government caught on by 2018 with the Pet and Women's Safety Act, and now there's $3 million in federal funding available each year to augment the private funding from Red Rover and some of the other agencies out there to help domestic violence shelters become pet friendly. I won't go into the details to what the laws say. They vary from state to state. If any of you need more detail, I'll give you my email address again. I can send you copies about this as to what each state law specifically says. There was a curious case in Delaware, which I wanted to just show you how this is not as simple as it sounds. Delaware has had pet protection orders since for many, many years. But the case of Tucker, the golden doodle of Delaware, came about last year, I think it was, or 2023. Um, Family court in Delaware allows the court to award possession and provide for the animal's care when dividing marital property. Okay, they have a pet protection order, and to consider the animal's well-being. They have one of these divorce settlement laws. The problem was this particular couple, Karen and Joseph, weren't married. They were living together, and they had been fighting ever since they had broken up the year before. And they went to court to try to determine who's going to get Tucker, the golden doodle. Three separate courts issued three different decisions. And, she said that Tucker, the dog, had been her support during her cancer treatment, and the guy took Tucker out of state to avoid, her getting him. He said no, the dog had been a gift from his daughter, and she had abandoned Tucker. It's a he said, she said kind of situation. Case went into Chancery Court, and under Delaware's laws, and of course each state's laws are different, in terms of allocating real property in a divorce settlement, it defaults to a physical division of property or a public auction if the parties can't come to an agreement. So the judge had several options. One was to do the Solomon bit and slice Tucker in half, which of course he certainly wasn't going to do, or she wasn't going to do. Second was to have the couple agree to a bidding auction and the highest bidder would buy out the other party's interest. Third option was to award custody based on Tucker's best interests and grant, money to the other party, or have the parties suggest their own solution. What do you think the judge wound up doing? Judge scratched her head or his head and said, partition Tucker, which is the terminology they use in Delaware. One party will own them, the other will get money, and the couple will have to determine the details for themselves. Do they work? The answer is yes. We don't have a lot of statistics on this. We only have numbers from two states. When Minnesota put pet protection orders into effect in 2010, they kept numbers for 3 years and then they stopped counting for some reason. But just over that first 3 year period, okay, 185 of the protection orders in Minnesota included pets. 3 years later, it was over 1,000. So you can see that, once the word gets out, people took advantage of it. We've got longer lasting numbers from New York State, which is much more complex. There are 8 different types of court systems. They started this in 2007. By 2020, they went from slightly over 200 cases a year to over 7,200 protection orders a year filed, that included pets. So it does work. Bottom line is we don't have a lot of data about this. Getting statistics from the state's administrative offices of the courts is a challenge. But once the word gets out and people know that pets can be included in protection orders, and courts are trained to issue them, and attorneys and advocates start promoting them, the demand is going to increase dramatically. So where do we all go from here? We got about 15 minutes. Good. We'll have some time for Q&A. Pet inclusive transitional housing and permanent housing for both the two-legged and four-legged survivors of domestic violence is critical. And I know that's what My Dog is My Home is all about. Um, but we need to, make sure we're focused on the domestic violence aspect of that as well. We need to remove breed and size restrictive policies in rental housing and motel housing. I had a case of that just a couple of weeks ago. A woman called me up from Florida. She was fleeing domestic violence. She had four German shepherds, and the motel would allow her to have two dogs in a room with her, but not four. So she would have to rent two motel rooms, and she couldn't afford two rooms. What's she going to do? And I didn't really have a good answer for her. Couldn't really help her out on that one, unfortunately. Um, we need greater presence of veterinarians working with street people, the street dog coalitions in several cities, breaking down the cost barriers for homeless people who have pets. And again, if you watch that Sleeping Rough video, you'll see how intense those attachments are. We'd like to see the homeless shelters become as pet friendly as domestic violence shelters have become as well. Let me wrap it up with this great quote. Jennifer Wolfe is a forensic veterinarian out in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I just love what she says. She says, the canary in the coal mine of an abusive home may literally be an abused canary. By responding to the injury or death of that canary, we can potentially save many other pets and people. So that's a quick spin through all this. Again, there's our email address, our website. Feel free to browse there if you'd like to get our link letter or you need more information. You have any, questions we don't get around to answering today, just shoot me an email and be more than pleased to help you out. And if you have any other organizations, we'd love to, provide trainings for them too. So Zoe, let me turn it back to you there. I know you've been monitoring some questions and I'll see what I can do about answering some of them.
Thanks so much. And what a fabulous presentation. I always learn something new when I join your session. So, fantastic job, Phil. Our first questions, you kind of answered briefly, but maybe there's a resource that you might be able to share. Which states and provinces include animals in the protection plans or protection orders, and what does that protection plan look like?
I showed the map there with the 42 states. Okay. But if you want to send me an email, I'll send you a complete list with the statutes. They're listed there. And we also have the Canadian provinces on there as well. Just to send me an email and I will send that off to you.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Our next question asks, how can communities build stronger partnerships between housing providers, domestic violence shelters, and animal welfare organizations to better support survivors with pets?
Boy, that's a good one. First is establish lines of communication and build relationships. It's all about relationships. It's all about knowing people. And the fact is, we live in a society of silos. And the animal shelters often don't know about the homeless agencies that are there or the DV agencies and vice versa. So it starts with making contact with the directors of those organizations and saying, hey, can we come and just talk to your people about what we do? And can you come and talk to our people about what we do? And find areas where we can interface with each other. Um, because we're all dealing with the same issues and we're all dealing with the same people. Okay. Animal shelters don't want animals turned in because the people are homeless. Okay. Um, they're trying to cut down on the number of animals coming in because they can't, house all of them. One solution, and I can't believe that, nobody's really picked up on this. Um, Animal shelters get inundated with people saying, I can't find an apartment where I can keep my pet. Domestic violence shelters have a problem with people leaving the shelter, going into transitional or long-term housing where they can't keep their pet. What would happen if those two agencies got their volunteers together to compile a list of pet-friendly apartments in that community? Um, should be a really nice project for a graduate student somewhere or a volunteer. There's a great website. It's called apartments.com. Go to their website. It lists every apartment house in the country, and you can filter out by, zip code or by community and what you're looking for. And, it's a number of bathrooms and bedrooms and the rent. But one of the factors you can filter for is whether they accept pets or not. And of course, there are restrictions, and there's, the breed restriction and the size restriction. And I don't have an easy answer for all of that, but I know My Dog is My Home has been working on that for a long time. Um, but at least it's a starting point. Get the groups together, and again, there's strength in numbers, and by showing you got the people and the animal people working together, more likely to get either legislation or programs, changed.
And you kind of touched on this in your last answer, but what is one practical change that could be implemented right now to better protect both survivors and their animals?
Just that very simple thing. A directory of pet-friendly apartments, more pet-friendly domestic violence and homeless shelters, uh, getting the uh, shelters that don't accept pets to listen to those shelters that have done it and understand it can be done. Yeah, there are challenges. And in many cases, I'll admit it's impossible. There may be zoning restrictions, cost factors um, that don't have the space. I mean, there are a lot of places where it can't work. And if that doesn't work, there's off-site foster care programs. And this is where the DV shelter and the animal shelter or the local veterinarians or the boarding kennels can come in. And it's not just dogs and cats. And what do you do with that canary? What do you do with that iguana? What do you do with that llama? What do you do with that horse? Okay. The animal shelters, particularly in larger communities, are very well connected. Okay. If they're out on a case and they see somebody, with 14 horses, they've got resources on how to deal with that. Okay. So the animal people know what's going on in animal land. They don't know what's going on in domestic violence land or homeless land. Okay. But by starting that dialogue, getting the lines of communications open, and vice versa, things happen.
Yeah, my most unique request was a bat, a pet bat. I thought I was like, we'll figure it out. Um, what recourse or ethical guidance do you recommend when a veterinarian is hesitant or explicitly refuses to report suspected abuse or neglect?
Oh
How
boy.
can advocates best advocate this link when a primary gatekeeper of animal welfare is reluctant to engage in a legal system?
Boy, I could talk for an hour and a half about that one. Um, First argument is it's the right thing to do. Second argument, do you really want that client in your practice? Third argument, there's no evidence that physicians have lost clients because they report child abuse. There's no evidence that veterinarians are going to lose clients as well. And if anything, if the word gets out, the public will respect the veterinarian for taking a stand more so than the fear of getting a bad write-up on social media. Um, they argue that these are dangerous people and that there is some risk to that. Absolutely. Fact is, the human healthcare field crossed that bridge years ago, and there are all sorts of procedures in place in human medical facilities to send out subtle signals or call for help if there is a potential threat. Um, the thing we have now policies by American Veterinary Medical Association and particularly the American Animal Hospital Association, also the Canadian VMA and the Royal College in the UK, that explicitly give veterinarians encouragement and organizational support to report suspected abuse. So they have the peer support. We have resources for them in terms of how to recognize. Um, we also have to overcome one big issue, which is that veterinarians are incredibly well trained at diagnosing conditions and treating it. That's what they're trained to do, and they do a fabulous job of it. When they see a case of animal cruelty, they feel uncomfortable that they can't diagnose it. They can't specifically treat it. It goes against all of their training. And so they're reluctant to get involved. And they'll say, I don't know if it's cruelty. Their answer to that is, you don't have to. If you see something, say something. Report it to the appropriate agency. And they were saying, well, I don't know who to report to. That's why we came up with our directory to tell them who to report to. Admittedly, in many areas of this country, it's not going to go anywhere. Admittedly, the police or the sheriff in smaller communities don't really care about it. Um, Veterinarians were telling us, okay, I made a report and then I never heard back. I never knew what happened. Okay, so we need to have feedback going back to the veterinarian. But the fact is, the vet is a gatekeeper. It's the animal's first line of defense. and they don't have to know. It's just if they suspect something, report it and let the system work itself out. It's no different than, we're animal control officers don't have to be experts in child abuse to make a report of suspected child abuse, and vice versa. Child abuse people don't have to be experts to report suspected animal maltreatment. They just have to report.
All right, our next question is, are there any additional complications for women in rural areas getting access to PPOs?
Oh, yeah. Well, first of all sorts of complications in rural areas for domestic violence. Okay. Fewer agencies. She's 100 miles from the nearest shelter. She's trapped on the farm. He's got the keys to the pickup truck. She's in a small community where everybody knows everybody's business. Okay. It's harder for her to escape and to make the break. I mean, that's unfortunately a given condition. And then now we have the complication of the farm animals as well that can enter into that. Um, so we would like to see more outreach in rural areas and tribal areas. I mean, that's a whole area we haven't even begun to touch, um, to address these concerns. I mean, the situation isn't 100% perfect in urban areas either, but it's really critical in rural areas as well.
All right, we have probably time for one more question. And this question is, what opposition exists, if any?
You'll love this one. We've had a couple of cases where um, bills to implement pet protection orders got shot down by the NRA. Pardon the pun. Uh, the NRA argued, with huge lobbying efforts, lobby before legislators that why should a guy, have to lose his gun and not be able to go hunting on Saturday just because he kicked the cat. Those bills eventually passed, but there was an opposition there. We've had opposition to the animal sex abuse bills. Biggest one I can think of was in Wisconsin, where the bill finally passed the House and passed the Senate, but the president of the state Senate shot it down on the last day of the legislature because he thought it was too unpleasant a topic to talk about on the last day of the legislative session. um, those are just two examples, and there are plenty more.
Okay, great. Well, then I think we have time for, oh no, we're pretty much at time. So I'm going to go ahead
Okay.
and close it. But again, if you have any additional questions that were not answered during our time together, please don't hesitate to reach out to Phil. He has graciously provided us with his email address. Um, and thank you so much for your time and expertise. I know I learned a lot and will be able to take this into the work that I'm doing. And I just so appreciate the advocacy that you've been doing for so many years to support survivors and their pets.
Thank you, Zoe. And we appreciate everything you're doing and everything My Dog Is My Home is doing. We're all in this together. And if it takes a village to, save a child or a woman or a pet, then, we just need to grow that village.
Absolutely.
All right.
Well, thank you, everyone. Take care.
Okay. See you later. Bye-bye.
Chasing the night away, never judging.